Hawaii sits farther from any other landmass than any other populated island chain on Earth. Thousands of kilometers of open Pacific, separating it from the nearest continent in every direction. In the middle of that chain, an island shaped by two separate volcanoes fused together by a narrow, fertile valley has drawn Polynesian voyagers, whaling ships, sugar barons, and now millions of tourists a year, each wave leaving its own permanent mark. And just 3 years ago, this same island watched its own history burn. In a single afternoon, in the most destructive wildfire the United States has seen in over a century. This is Maui, and understanding how it actually works today means understanding both its isolation and everything that isolation couldn't ultimately protect it from. Picture an island born from two volcanoes rising up out of the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean, so far from any other landmass that its earliest human inhabitants had to navigate thousands of kilometers of open water, using nothing but stars, currents, and generations of accumulated knowledge just to find it in the first place. Picture that same remote island transformed generation after generation by whalers, missionaries, sugar barons, and eventually a tourism industry now responsible for feeding, housing, and employing most of the people who live there. And picture a historic town on that island's coast, one that had survived nearly 2 centuries as a whaling port and a kingdom's capital, reduced to ash in a single terrifying afternoon in 2023. How does an island this isolated end up carrying this much history and this much recent tragedy all at once? Let's find out. Maui is the second largest island in the Hawaiian archipelago, formed from 2 separate shield volcanoes that grew large enough over millions of years to eventually merge, connected today by a broad, fertile isthmus that gives the island its nickname, the Valley Isle. The younger, larger of those 2 volcanoes, Haleakalā, rises more than 3,000 meters above sea level. Its massive summit crater so vast and otherworldly that early astronauts reportedly used it to help train for lunar missions. Its dormant slopes now protected as a national park, drawing roughly 1 million visitors a year, many of them arriving before dawn, specifically to watch sunrise from above the clouds, a moment of near total silence, at an elevation where the surrounding sky often glows in colors that look almost unreal. Haleakalā last erupted sometime between the late 15th and early 17th centuries, and while it remains technically active rather than truly extinct, its dormancy has lasted long enough that most residents think of it more as a defining feature of the landscape than as any kind of ongoing threat. The older, more eroded West Maui Mountains complete the island's distinctive figure-8 shape. Their steep, deeply carved valleys home to some of the wettest, most lush terrain found anywhere in the islands, a striking contrast to the dry, sun-baked leeward coastlines just a short drive away. A single afternoon on Maui, capable of carrying a visitor from misty rainforest waterfalls to arid, cactus-studded plains without ever leaving the island at all. That dramatic range of landscapes exists specifically because of the extreme isolation surrounding the entire Hawaiian chain. Sitting thousands of kilometers from the nearest continental landmass in every direction, the islands evolved largely free from outside competition for millions of years, allowing plant and animal species that arrived here by chance, carried on wind, waves, or the occasional bird, to develop into forms found absolutely nowhere else on Earth. Haleakalā's upper slopes alone host several native forest bird species that exist only on this single mountain, some down to just a few hundred remaining individuals, alongside the silver sword, a striking, spiky desert plant that grows nowhere else in the world and can take decades to finally bloom just once before dying. That same isolation that shaped Maui's unique ecology also shaped its human history, since reaching these islands at all required one of the most extraordinary feats of navigation in human history. Polynesian voyagers first reached Maui roughly 1,300 years ago, sailing enormous double-hulled canoes across vast stretches of open Pacific Ocean using wave patterns, star positions, and the behavior of birds and marine life to guide them, arriving with no prior certainty that land even existed in the direction they were sailing, a feat of navigation and courage that modern scholars continue to study and, in some cases, attempt to recreate using traditional methods and vessels built according to ancestral designs. Once settled, early Hawaiian communities on Maui developed an extraordinarily sophisticated system for managing the island's limited resources, organizing land into wedge-shaped divisions called ahupua'a, each stretching from the mountain summit down to the surrounding reef, giving every community access to the full range of resources: upland forest, freshwater streams, fertile valley farmland, and coastal fishing grounds, needed to sustain itself entirely on its own. That system reflected a genuinely holistic understanding of the connection between mountain and sea, since damage done to a forest at the top of an ahupua'a could directly affect the health of a fish pond at its base many kilometers downstream. An ecological relationship Hawaiian communities managed deliberately through careful, community-enforced resource stewardship long before the concept of watershed management existed anywhere in Western science. Elaborate irrigated terraces supported extensive taro cultivation, the starchy root vegetable that remained the foundation of the traditional Hawaiian diet for centuries, alongside carefully managed fish ponds built directly into the coastline. Engineering achievements that allowed a population estimated at several 100,000 people across the islands to thrive sustainably for generations before any outside contact at all. A 14th century Maui chief named Pikalani is credited with building one of the island's largest stone temples, along with an extensive road system connecting communities around the island's perimeter. Physical evidence of a sophisticated, organized society that had already existed on Maui for centuries before any European ship ever appeared on the horizon. That self-sufficient world changed dramatically and irreversibly following the arrival of European and American ships beginning in the late 1700s, when British explorer James Cook became the first documented European to encounter the Hawaiian Islands, opening the archipelago to a wave of foreign contact that would reshape it permanently within just a few generations. Diseases introduced by foreign sailors, to which native Hawaiians had no prior immunity, devastated the population catastrophically, native numbers falling from an estimated 300,000 people at the time of first contact to only around 70,000 within less than a century, one of the steepest population collapses recorded anywhere in the Pacific, waves of measles, smallpox, and other illnesses tearing repeatedly through communities that had never before been exposed to anything like them. Lahaina, on Maui's western coast, became a critical hub during this transformation, serving briefly as the capital of the unified Kingdom of Hawaii in the early 1800s, and later becoming one of the busiest whaling ports in the entire Pacific, with hundreds of ships anchoring offshore during peak season, their crews filling the town's streets and scenes. That famously clashed with the strict moral codes introduced by Christian missionaries who had also established themselves in Lahaina around the same period, tensions between rowdy whaling crews seeking liquor and companionship, and missionaries pushing for stricter public morality, occasionally boiling over into open confrontation in the town's crowded streets. The discovery of petroleum around 1850 eventually undercut demand for whale oil worldwide, sending Lahaina's whaling economy into steady decline over the following decades, just as an entirely new industry was beginning to take root across the island's interior. As whaling declined through the mid-1800s, sugar rose to take its place as the dominant force reshaping Maui's economy and landscape. Commercial sugar cultivation, which began on the island in the 1840s, expanded dramatically over the following decades, transforming vast stretches of Maui into sprawling plantation fields and requiring enormous quantities of water to be diverted from the island's wetter windward valleys to the drier plains where sugar grew most profitably. Engineering projects like the 1878 Hamakua Ditch, carrying water across considerable distances specifically to feed the booming industry, part of a broader network of irrigation infrastructure that fundamentally rerouted the island's natural water flow. That expansion came at a direct cost to native Hawaiians, particularly following the 1848 Great Mahele, a sweeping land reform that opened Hawaiian land to private ownership for the first time and allowed foreign planters to accumulate enormous landholdings, one single company alone eventually controlling tens of thousands of acres, while many Hawaiian families found themselves pushed off traditional lands or drawn into wage labor on plantations that had, in some cases, been built on ground their own ancestors had once farmed communally under the older Ahupua system. Sugar profits soared further during the American Civil War, when the collapse of Louisiana's sugar supply opened a significant gap in the American market that Hawaiian producers rushed to fill, cementing sugar's position as the dominant force in the island's economy and, eventually, in their politics as well, as American and European planters grew wealthy and politically influential enough to play a direct role in the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy itself by the close of the century. To keep those expanding plantations running, sugar and later pineapple growers imported waves of contract laborers from China, Japan, the Philippines, Portugal, Puerto Rico, and Korea, entire immigrant communities settling into plantation camps that gradually grew into permanent towns, still scattered across Maui today. Places like Paia and Puunani that began as company-built labor camps and slowly evolved into genuine, rooted communities in their own right. That deliberate mixing of cultures, thrown together by economic necessity rather than choice, ultimately produced much of what defines local Hawaiian culture in the present day, from Hawaiian Pidgin English itself, a distinct Creole language born directly out of plantation-era communication needs among workers who often shared no common. By the 1930s, plantation work employed tens of thousands of people across the islands, labor conditions eventually improving only after major organized strikes, including a sweeping 1946 action that shut down nearly every plantation in the Keo. Territory at once, and won lasting gains for workers who had spent generations laboring under difficult, often exploitative conditions, a labor movement that would go on to shape Hawaiian politics for decades after the plantations themselves eventually began to close. Sugar and pineapple cultivation eventually declined across the latter half of the 20th century, unable to compete economically with lower-cost producers elsewhere in the world, and tourism steadily rose to take their place as Maui's dominant industry, a transition largely completed by the final decades of the century, the island's last major sugar mill finally closing its doors in the 2010s after more than a century of continuous operation. Today, tourism accounts for the overwhelming majority of Maui's economic activity, drawing millions of visitors annually to attractions ranging from the winding, waterfall-lined road to Hana, a slow, dramatic drive along dozens of one-lane bridges and hairpin turns, tracing the island's lush, windward coast to the island's world-famous beaches at Kaanapali and Wailea, lined today with resorts that occupy land once covered almost entirely by sugarcane, alongside a globally significant humpback whale sanctuary in the surrounding waters, where thousands of whales migrate each winter to breed and give birth within sight of the island's coastline, their distinctive breaches and songs drawing whale-watching boats out from harbors across the island every winter season. Alongside that economic transformation, recent decades have also brought a genuine, deliberate revival of native Hawaiian language and culture. Decades after, both had been actively suppressed under territorial and early statehood policy. Hawaiian language immersion schools, hula halau preserving traditional dance and chant, and a broader cultural and political movement asserting native Hawaiian rights and sovereignty have all grown significantly in visibility and influence across the islands, part of a wider reckoning with the plantation era's legacy and the earlier loss of Hawaiian land, language, and self-governance that followed European and American contact. Then, on the 8th of August, 2023, that layered, complicated history collided directly with catastrophe. Driven by unusually strong winds from a passing hurricane offshore, a wildfire tore through Lahaina with terrifying speed, destroying the vast majority of the historic town within a matter of hours and killing more than 100 people, making it the deadliest wildfire the United States has experienced in over a century. Residents describe the fire's speed as almost incomprehensible. Entire neighborhoods engulfed within minutes, some families escaping only by wading into the ocean itself as flames closed in around them from every other direction, while emergency warning systems failed to alert much of the town in time. Landmarks that had stood since the whaling era, including a centuries-old banyan tree that had shaded the town's central square since 1873, were badly damaged or destroyed entirely, alongside thousands of homes, leaving roughly 12,000 residents displaced almost overnight from a community many families had called home for generations, a single afternoon erasing physical evidence of nearly 2 centuries of Maui's layered history all at once, from the era of Hawaiian royalty through whaling, missionary settlement, and plantation life. More than 3 years later, as of this past August, Lahaina's recovery remains genuinely difficult and painfully incomplete. County records show roughly a quarter of the destroyed single-family homes have been rebuilt so far, concentrated mostly in inland neighborhoods further from the coast, while homes closer to the ocean face additional delays tied to erosion and environmental concerns. The vast majority of residents displaced from the burn area, close to 90% by recent survey estimates, remain living elsewhere on the island or beyond, even as most say they intend to eventually return, an intention increasingly complicated by a persistent shortage of affordable housing that predates the fire itself but has since grown considerably worse. Unemployment and financial hardship remain elevated among fire-affected households compared to before the disaster, and county officials have continued working through a multi-billion-dollar recovery effort, funding affordable housing rebuilds, clearing wildfire debris from thousands of properties, and slowly restoring commercial infrastructure along Lahaina's historic Front Street, even as many residents openly express frustration with how slowly that recovery continues to unfold. That housing crisis, compounded but not created by the fire, reflects a tension that had already been building on Maui for years before the disaster struck. An island economy built overwhelmingly around tourism has, for decades, driven demand for vacation rentals and second homes that compete directly with local residents for an already limited housing supply on an island where, much like anywhere else in Hawaii, buildable land remains genuinely scarce and every basic good still has to be shipped in across thousands of kilometers of ocean. Rising costs tied to that dynamic have pushed a significant share of Maui's own residents to consider leaving the island entirely in recent years, a genuinely uncomfortable irony for a place whose entire modern economy depends on convincing outsiders to visit, even as many of the people who actually keep that economy running increasingly struggle to afford living there themselves. And yet, despite the weight of everything the island has absorbed, waves of foreign contact, disease, land loss, plantation labor, and now one of the most devastating disasters in recent American history, Maui's roughly 160,000 residents continue rebuilding, replanting, and reasserting a cultural identity that has proven again and again remarkably resilient. Hawaiian language now echoes through classrooms that once forbade it entirely. Traditional fish ponds and taro patches are being restored by community groups working to revive practices nearly lost to the plantation era. And in Lahaina itself, families are slowly, patiently returning, rebuilding not just houses, but a community whose roots on this specific stretch of coastline reach back centuries before whaling ships, sugar barons, or tourists ever arrived at all. In the end, Maui's story isn't really about isolation protecting it from the outside world, because it never really did, from the first Polynesian voyagers, to whalers, to sugar planters, to modern tourism, to a fire that reshaped an entire town within hours. It's about what a community does after each of those waves arrives, absorbing the change, losing something real each time, and still finding a way to hold on to what makes the place unmistakably its own. If Maui's layered history, from ancient voyaging canoes to a still unfolding recovery, surprised you, subscribe, because there are more islands out there carrying far deeper, more complicated stories than their postcard images ever let on.